Good evening. I'm Warwick Moss. There is nothing quite as heart-wrenching as seeing a loved one head off to war. Nothing quite prepares a person for seeing someone they care about sail into the distance, not knowing if they will ever see them again. Generations of Australians have felt the pain. Far too many know the feeling of total loss. But sometimes fate steps in to ease that pain, overcoming insurmountable odds to soothe a broken heart. This is one such story. A weather-beaten bottle, washed up on a remote shore. Inside, a crumpled, yellowing letter that told of a simple soldier's yearning to find someone he loved. For more than half a century, the bottle and its precious contents braved the elements, crossed unfriendly oceans, and travelled untold distances, until last year, when it finally reached its destination.
If he had written before then, I didn't get the letters because a lot of mail went astray at that time, and maybe I wasn't meant to get it. It's hard to know. And this is why I think it's strange that he should correspond with me by putting a letter into a bottle when there's such a thing as an envelope and a stamp.
It happened every day in every war. Homesick soldiers writing to those they loved, those they missed dearly. But few of those letters have a history to match one written on board the Empress of Canada on January the 15th, 1940.
To whom it may concern, would anyone finding this letter please see if they can find Miss Nola McKinney, my daughter, aged 11, on the 6th of August.
The writer was Gunner Bill McKinney from RHQ 4th Field Regiment, New Zealand Artillery. Like thousands of others, he was bound for the inhospitable battlefields of the Middle East. Like every one of them, he had no idea what was in store. No idea whether he'd return from the horrors of war. At 41, Gunner McKinney was a veteran who'd bent the rules so that he could join his two younger brothers in the desert campaign. 11-year-old Nola was the daughter he hadn't seen for 2 years. The daughter he'd lost when his marriage fell apart back home in New Zealand.
Please let her know that her father is on his way to the war.
Gunner McKinney was obviously desperate, willing to try anything to make contact. We now know when he wrote the letter, January the 15th, 1940. But to this day, no one really knows when or where he hit upon the really novel part of his idea. It was somewhere at sea, somewhere on the Empress of Canada's voyage between New Zealand and Egypt. It seemed like an impossible dream. A father on his way to war, a daughter he loved, a daughter he feared he'd never see again. His message in a bottle, cast into a vast ocean, cast perhaps into oblivion. A hope that lived with Gunner McKinney through those dark days of war. A hope that would not be realised for more than 53 years. In fact, not until a spring day in September last year, a remarkable day for South Australian bushwalker Jim Newland. He was on a 3-day trek through the desolate dune country of Eyre Peninsula when he stumbled on a tiny glinting piece of history.
There's long stretches of beach and to find a bottle on a beach of that size is pretty much like picking a needle up in a haystack, I suppose. You know, it's pretty lucky. I would have put it 30 to 40 metres above the high tide mark. It was behind the first low coastal dune, and it was laying quite clearly above the top of the sand. Probably only the bottom third of the bottle would have been under the sand. The rest was quite clearly exposed. I think probably that it would have lodged on the beach and probably would have been windblown well up onto the beach in strong winds and lodged behind that first coastal dune, and it probably would have laid there for many years. I guess the most significant thing for me was the age of the letter and the fact that it was in such good condition. Realised pretty well straight away that it was a genuine article.
15th of January 1940. To whom it may concern. Would anyone finding this letter please see if they can find Miss Nola?
Tossed around the southern seas for decades. Half buried in sand dunes on an isolated South Australian beach. Thousands of kilometres from where it was written. After more than 50 years, and who knows what kind of adventures, Gunnar McKenny's note had finally been unearthed. Still intact, still legible, but still a long, long way from Nola. Jim Newland did the best he could to preserve the old letter and began wondering how he could trace the writer and his daughter, the girl called Nola, who was 11 years old in 1940.
We sort of surmised that she would have had to have been in her 60s now, and we thought, well, there's a good chance that she would be alive. And then we started to think a bit more about Bill and the possibility of him surviving the war, and we worked out that he'd have to be, originally we thought he'd probably, having an 11-year-old daughter, he'd have to be at least in his, you know, sort of mid-30s or early 30s. And so we figured he might have been in his 80s and could still be alive. So we thought it was wonderful to be up with this guy, and actually to meet the guy that actually wrote that, that would have been extraordinary.
What Jim did was contact his local newspaper, the Adelaide Advertiser, where reporter Chris Hackett entered the investigation.
Obviously the problems involved in tracking down someone who was now at least 50 years older and also had very possibly changed her name, as she had, as it turned out, made it necessary for us to go through the father's side to check down against his war records, which turned out to be the way we did it.
Chris Hackett's search led him to New Zealand, where the Return Services Association delved into their files and located Gunnar McKenny's hometown.
They did have some relatives from the hometown. It was a matter of eliminating them and doing some interviews with those people in an attempt to work out who young Nola might have been and what would have become her in that 50-year period.
A month after the letter was found on an isolated beach in South Australia, 53 years and 9 months after it was written, the contact was made. By now, Nola McKenny was Nola Lyons, a mother and grandmother who was living hundreds and hundreds of kilometres away in Sydney.
I came in at 7 o'clock at night, my phone was ringing. Picked up the phone and I had a very excited cousin from New Zealand. I thought, this is great, they don't spend much money on phoning. And she said, I have the most wonderful news for you. And I was a bit skittish. I said, I won the lottery and I didn't even buy a ticket. No. And then she started to tell me about this bottle story, and I was so confused. I didn't know what she was talking about.
It was about that bottle, that letter, found by Jim Newland, who also called Nola that night.
I thought, gee, I might be digging up some old wounds here, particularly for Nola and the family. You don't know the circumstances about the separation and all those sorts of things, and I thought, do I really want to dig up this past, and do I, I needed to be fairly careful about how I approached it with Nola.
He was wonderful. He was fantastic. He put me through the 3rd degree to prove who I was. He said, how do you spell your surname? What are your father's initials? So I told him, and then the crowning question, how old are you? So I told him. He said, it's all here, it's you.
With that, the memories came flowing back. The separation, the war, the search for her father. and the reunion in New Zealand when Nola was a young woman of 21.
I knew him. He was right there. And he lifted his hat and he waved and blew me a kiss, and I thought, ah, there he is. Yeah. So we had 12 pretty wonderful weeks together. I got pretty well to know him. You don't really get to know a person in 12 weeks. But we had a good time. I found him a very intelligent man. I did several trips back to New Zealand and met him again and spent more time with him and got to know him some more. He was starting to get a little bit older now, so was I. And we were in touch right up until when he died. So not in 66. Yes.
In those happy years, Nola managed to build up a picture of her father's life, a life they'd never shared. The war veteran, the champion athlete, the accomplished musician. But not in all their time together, after the joyous reunion, did Bill McKenny ever mention his letter in a bottle, his plea for help as he set sail for war. News of that came out of the blue 27 years after his death.
The interesting thing was, and this will always stick in my head, it was within days of my father's birthday. He would have been 94 in a few days' time, and I thought, what other trick can he pull out of the bag to celebrate his birthday? It was just so coincidental. I think I could describe it almost as spooky, a little bit spooky.
A father's letter of love delivered across the seas and sands by sheer coincidence. A letter Nola Lyons will preserve and cherish forever.
As soon as I possibly could, I got it down to the State Library, to the Conservation Department, and they are repairing it and will put it into some sort of preservative. And I'll have it forever then, or it will last forever. So I really haven't touched that letter yet. Other people have, but I haven't even put my finger on it.
The whole thing's turned out to be really quite a happy story, and that was all I really wanted from the beginning, was to have a happy ending to the whole story, and it's turned out that way.
To whom it may concern, would anyone finding this letter
Please see if they can find Miss Nola McKenny, my daughter, aged 11 years, on the 6th of August, and was last known to be in Sydney.
please let her know that her father is on his way to the war with the New Zealand main body of artillery.
The letter took 3 years to get here. It was a little bit, but I'm glad I waited for it. It was on its way home, travelling in the right direction. Well, I'm just so pleased that I've got it. I think in a few days there's PS coming.